Mark, still Good Friday morning to you, and I feel like I'm piling on because we're all captivated by Carlos Correa as the star in our sport, and also when and where will he land? Is that still a question? Because we woke up this morning and we heard another team is involved. How true is that? Good morning.
Right. Good morning. So John Heyman, New York Post, reporting that at least one other team, maybe two, re-engaging with Carlos Correa and Scott Boras, and one of those teams seems to be the Minnesota Twins. Now, we know the Twins offered 10 years, $285 million, a far cry from the 12 years, $315 million that the Mets made a deal on. And so, what I have found is that with Scott Boras clients, oftentimes when there's chatter in one direction, it's really noise to try to drum up some response in the other direction. And so I think this is some pressure looking to be applied to the Mets. I think this deal is going to get done. I think it'll likely be done by Monday. Now, maybe something will change, but I really do think about it reasonably, rationally. No team that wasn't in initially is suddenly going to jump in saying, yeah, let me jump in here because the risk is less than it was before. We know he's got something with his leg going on. The money's still there. And of all the teams that can assume risk, Steve Cohen has the most money and the highest payroll, so the money's not the issue. And he can deal with the other part of the risk because he can afford it more than everybody else. And so I think the noise in a different direction about teams checking in is really just that little bit of pressure applied to the Mets. I think the Mets get the deal done over the weekend.
I was just going to ask that. That was going to be my next question. Is there a timetable involved, or is this infinity? But over the weekend and Monday is so interesting. We will be on the lookout for that. Meanwhile, in the Bronx, Brian Sabean first, Omar Minaya second. What will his day-to-day be, Steve?
Well, I think Omar's an ideas guy. Omar was my former assistant, general manager of Montreal and with the Mets again, and worked for the Players Association, the Padres, a couple times back with the Mets organization. Omar was an ideas guy for me. He would throw stuff against the wall and see what would stick. He would make a suggestion to me, and I'd be like, nah, I don't think so. Then a couple days later, he'd bring it up again. I'd say, nah, I don't think so. And then about 3 days later, I'd say, what about this guy? And it was the guy he was promoting to me, and he goes, I wish I had thought about that. He really comes up with ideas. I think he's a great fit. I think what the Yankees are doing, look, they haven't been able to get over the top. And when you're a GM for a long time, you get this groupthink going on. You've got similar people, same sort of thoughts. You're bringing in Brian Sabean. The Yankees need to close the deal. They've gotten to the playoffs. They need to win. Sabean did that 3 times in 2012, 14, and 16. And Omar's that ideas guy to think out of the box, which I think would be valuable for the Yankees. And he's not an all-in analytics guy. He's an evaluate with your eyes sort of an evaluator. I think this is great for Brian Cashman, and I think it shows a lot of strength on his part, bringing in 2 really solid executives to join his forces.
Additions matter, right? Not just player-wise. I feel like we're here every year with Brian Reynolds, and some would have said this should have happened a couple of years ago, right? Where are we now, January, first week of January with him?
Well, remember, he demanded a trade, and my thought was, well, then I can't trade him, because I would set a precedent if I'm Ben Cherington thinking, well, if I give into this, then every other player that doesn't get a deal is going to want to put pressure on me to get traded. So he hasn't been shopping Brian Reynolds around, but it hasn't stopped people from calling, and the calls are significant. A lot of teams chiming in. So he's looking at it saying, knock my socks off. I want a Juan Soto type deal. Keep putting players in. The Dodgers and Yankees, for me, the 2 farm systems that I think could make the best deal here. You could see the Yankees potentially putting a Peraza in the deal, an Oswaldo Cabrera in the deal, a Davy Garcia in the deal, Esteban Florial, because they could end up bringing Reynolds in. He'd be a huge player for them in left field. I think there's a good chance something gets done, and if not now, then probably at the deadline in 2023.
A Juan Soto type deal. Wow. Every trade deadline, every offseason. Here we are again. Steve Phillips with the very latest. Have a wonderful weekend. Thanks so much.
The 3-time All-Star left San Diego after 5 years as their all-time franchise home run leader. He had a lot of big moments in the big leagues, but Bob Costas will help us take a look back at the definitive day in the career of Nate Colbert.
MLB Network remembers
story.
Full circle, man.
Pretty cool story, no
That's
doubt.
amazing.
No doubt. So we're mourning the passing of Nate Colbert. You know, as you take a look at his career, he was an original Padre, right? He was there at the beginning. Was not drafted by the Padres, came later in his career. But none of the Padres teams that he played for were any good.
No, they were terrible.
We're talking about 100-loss teams every season except for one when he was in San Diego, a couple of 100-loss teams. And then Nate would move on and play with a number of other teams down the stretch. But we talked about the unique nature of his being the all-time franchise home run leader in that he only played there for a short time. And he played in a ballpark, his home ballpark, San Diego Stadium, later Jack Murphy Stadium, later Qualcomm, which was never friendly for homers, not until the very end, especially in the beginning of that franchise history in the late 60s and early 70s. It was monstrous. It was enormous. Yet a guy that played there for only 5 years hit more homers than anybody in franchise history. It speaks to the transient nature of the Padres roster. That's changing because eventually a guy like Manny Machado or Fernando Tatis has a chance to pass Nate Colbert's total, but nobody in between there. Not Steve Finley, not Ken Caminiti, Greg Vaughn. They were there for short periods of time. Phil Nevin had big years there. Ryan Klesko, big years there, but nobody ever hit more homers than Nate Colbert.
I mean, Matt, it was 330 to the corner with a Fenway Park-esque type wall. I mean, it was amazing seeing how big that place was and what it was like to hit home runs in that ballpark. It was just unbelievable. As a kid, being able to be there and look up and go, how do they hit home runs here?
Didn't your brother play with Nate?
Yeah. Donnie came up in the Padre organization, ended up playing with Nate. Dave Roberts, who I talk about often, David Wayne Roberts, he was a #1 pick for the Padres. He played with Nate. So it was that time when the Padres, being a new franchise, you're going to struggle. And they struggled, but Nate was like that poster child for the team. And that day in Atlanta, to hit 5 home runs in a double play and to stand up for this long a period of time.
It's amazing.
Shows you the power he had and just how, I mean, we look at Dave Winfield's career. He started in San Diego. Dave's homer totals would have been even greater. He played in that ballpark. It was a graveyard for home run hitters.
Yeah, one of Nate Colbert's last years in San Diego, I always have fun looking at Baseball Reference for these things, right? Yeah. 1973, and when you look at the roster on that team, Fred Kendall was the starting catcher, Jason's dad. Yeah. Starting catcher. Cito Gaston played right field for that Padres team. He was almost 30 years old. And the manager of that Padres team, a lot of folks don't recall a connection with Don Zimmer and the Padres.
Wow.
But
I didn't know that.
He was the skipper, having taken over for Preston Gomez in the early 70s. So, Nate Colbert passing away, an all-time great in San Diego Padres baseball history. Let's take a break.